Couldn't have asked for a better set of topics and discussions than what we've had this morning for the things we're about to talk about this morning. Bob talked to us about Paul going into Corinth, and a lot of that will apply for us today. The songs that David led us focused our hearts on God, the God that we serve. And think about Dennis' words and the foolishness of the cross. And those are the things that we'll talk about yet this morning. You know, there was a time in the recent past when we had a common foundation with communities around us, that we kind of had a common faith in a God. We understood a common standard. We could appeal to that standard when there was disagreement. And not only is that standard diminishing in applicability among Christians, but the standard is all but gone among the world. That who is God that I should serve him? Is there a God at all? C.S. Lewis once remarked, God is not the sort of thing that one can be moderately interested in. After all, if God does not exist, there's no reason to be interested in him at all. On the other hand, if God does exist, then this is of paramount interest. And our ultimate concern ought to be how to properly relate to this being upon whom we depend moment by moment for our very existence. If you're here today, what you think about the God who claims to be will have a profound impact on your life. If I'm wrong, if there is no God, we're wasting a whole lot of time this morning. We could be doing something else. But if there is a God, it has an impact on how you act every day, every hour. It has an impact on how I treat my fellow man, as we just sang, and the reverence I give to that God. And so today I want to ask that question, does God exist? As we think about Paul entering Corinth and going into Rome, what was the basis of his argument? Could he argue on the scriptures? Again, who is God that I should serve him? And so what he appealed to was logic and philosophy, the observable things around him. And yes, he brought up scripture at the appropriate time. Now, I have a liberal arts major, and so we hear things like philosophy, and we think about those kooks coming out of those liberal arts schools. But philosophy is truly trying to answer the profound questions of life by those things that we can see. And real philosophers use logic and reason, the kind of reason that God gave us, that we can apply those things to truly understand, does he exist? And so this morning, we'll look at three areas that prove that God does, in fact, exist. First, we'll look at science, because science proves that God exists. Second, we'll look at morality. And finally, we'll look at Christ and salvation. And what we're going to do as you follow on that journey with me is we're going to start with the outer world that we can see and observe. We'll come inside to the inner man, what's going on in here and in here. And finally, we will consider the observable facts that none can deny, where God himself proclaimed, I exist, and my son came to save you. Now, one may ask, and rightly so by the world's definition, if you believe in God, can you still believe in science? Is that possible that those two things correlate? It's so unfortunate how our society has pitted science against a belief in God. But in reality, science confirms that he is, and reason and logic demands that he is. And so I want to start there this morning. Let's start by asking the basic question, why is there something at all instead of nothing? If we believe in science that matter cannot be created or destroyed, why is there anything at all? But we exist in a physical, material universe. The fact that you're here proves the existence of something that started it. Things don't simply pop into existence. Molecules don't simply form in a vacuum. If you take a vacuum absent of everything and you set it aside for a day and there's something inside it growing, what must the scientists conclude? We've corrupted the sample. If you set that same vacuum for 50 years and something was inside it, you've corrupted the sample. If it's there for millions of years and there's something inside it, it is corrupted. A vacuum can create nothing. Maybe you've heard of Dr. William Lane Craig say repeatedly, at least in the case when a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, you start out with at least a magician in a hat. And yet scientists today want us to believe that there was no magician, there was no hat, but the rabbit appeared. How insane for us to be duped by that. How do we explain the origin of the material universe, the physical things that are in front of us? And by some very intelligent theoreticians, we are being told that in all seriousness, with bald-faced lying, that something came from nothing despite everything else we've told you about science. It's a logical fallacy. The Big Bang assumes that something pre-existed in order to bang. Where did that come from? And so, science affirms, and I'm going to give you 3 examples why, that matter had a beginning. Again, the second law of thermodynamics says that matter cannot be created or destroyed. And scientists believe one of 2 things. Either A, that matter was eternal, and so that explains how there was something to bang. Or B, that we're going to find something someday that explains this. And if you watch scientists today who debate those who raise these questions, all they can answer is, we haven't found it yet. And that's a legitimate answer from a scientist who cannot observe what has happened in the past. And unfortunately for them, science is now allied squarely and powerfully against this premise that matter is eternal. And so let's allow the science to speak for itself with the idea of entropy. What they did learn is that, yes, there is no more energy to be created. There is no matter to be created. What exists now has existed since it began. But what we do know is that every time a process or reaction happens, that energy got a little less useful. And the next reaction that happens, that energy got a little less useful. And that's the idea of entropy. It's less useful than it was before. Well, if that's the case, then energy is degrading over time, becomes less useful. There's a common quantity of energy, but the quality of it degrades. And so they were forced to conclude that eventually the cosmos will run out of usable energy. That's the only logical conclusion based on what they're observing. The maximum level of energy at the beginning of the cosmos, eventually there will be no more light, there will be no more fiery stars, there will be no more gas. Why? Because it takes energy to make those things, and if it degrades over time, eventually, if time goes on eternally, it will run out. That's the conclusion they're forced to accept. And so these facts are not only scientifically demonstrated, but they are eminently logical. Logically, they force us to the conclusion that the universe could not have been infinitely old. Because if it were, all the usable energy would now be gone. So if you say it comes to a logical end, but that we existed forever ago, then why is there any useful energy at all? Again, why is there something instead of nothing? If matter would eternal, it would have run out. The universe has a finite history, and it will have a finite end, all things being left to itself. Now, I'll have to say, as I prepared for this lesson, one of the things that troubled me is I usually have a lot more scripture than this. But when we're reasoning with man who doesn't accept God and doesn't accept his scripture, we have to start with what he can see and what he can observe and what he can measure. Another thing that man has observed, in 1929, American astronomer Edwin Hubble, maybe you've heard that name before, empirically confirmed that the universe is expanding at a constant rate. The universe is expanding at a constant rate. If something's expanding at a constant rate, for the old people in the room, and you put that VHS back in the VCR and you hit rewind, what will you find? It came from a common point. Now, let me tell you the ridiculous part of this theory, and I know the camera won't see this, but here's what we do. We take out this measurement, right? And we get over here and we look at it and we measure this and we say, here is the constant rate of the universe. And so it must have been moving at that constant rate ever since it ever began. Oh, but that Big Bang happened really fast, but ever since then, it's been constant. And so if we need to rewind the clock, we can calculate how old it's been around. But we got to discount that Big Bang. But we need it to be long enough that it formed life because we still don't know how that happened. A universe that expands at a constant rate, there is no way to get around the fact that you are assuming that it started at a singular point in time. And they cannot have the one observation of an expanding universe without accepting the other, that it started with a singular point in time. Matter is not eternal. Proof number 2. Proof number 3. In 1965, 2 researchers from Bell Labs were testing a very sensitive antenna. The intent of this antenna was to detect very low levels of microwave radiation. And there was just this persistent noise that they kept picking up on that microwave radiation, this background noise of microwave radiation. And what's interesting, just years before, is other scientists from Princeton University have theorized that if there was, in fact, this massive expansion of a universe, it would leave a residual microwave radiation. They couldn't prove it. They had no way to measure it, but that was their hypothesis. And along in 65, these 2 researchers have discovered it, confirming the theory that things happened so quickly that it left this residual behind. Again, confirming that there was a physical material universe that is finite. It had a beginning. And everything that we observe shows us that it will end because there will be no more useful energy at the end. And so, science proves through these means that matter, the physical world, is not infinite. It started and it will end. So let's switch over to reason, because not only does science prove it, but logic demands it. And again, I respect the philosophers of the ages who were not trying to just spout some theory, but they were truly trying to answer the questions of life based on what they could observe and what they could intuit. And so even without scientific confirmation, the application of logic alone forces us to the same conclusion. There's no doubt that the physical material universe exists. We're in it. That's a fact, is it not? If you disagree, you might want to find a door. We are here. And everything that exists has a cause. I am here because of a decision of my parents. That was the cause for my existence. And likewise, the universe is here because of some cause. Something happened that made it pop up. And so we accept it as a law that matter cannot be created or destroyed. Then we have to say it had a creation. And the thing that explains the physical universe existence, think about this. If something created all that is physical, then what was the nature of the thing that created it? It cannot have been physical. It cannot have been material. And so, like our teachers told us, you can't use the word to define the word. You can't use physical matter to create physical matter. Something outside, extant from physical matter had to create that everything we see, all the physical matter that is here. And so, you can neither create it from something physical. And thus, we must conclude that it was caused by, and I'll put it in quotes, it was caused by this thing that was different from everything physical. I'll use the word God, call it what you may. But that thing that was not physical created all the physical things that we see. And what else do we learn about causation? The thing that causes something else is superior to it. It is greater than it. Consider which is greater, the wind or the tree? The wind that blows the tree or the tree that can be ripped out of the ground by the force of the wind? Which is greater? Which is greater, the destruction of the atomic bomb or the human mind that brought it to bear? Which is greater? And so the cause, by its definition, is superior to the effect. And so if there is this God that exists outside of all the physical that was created, we must also conclude that it is greater than all it affected, all that it made. And so not only through science do we learn it, but logic demands that if we exist and we accept that everything that exists has an explanation, and that what exists has to be made by something greater than it and something different than it. There has to be something. And today, I'll call it God. And after reading this, there's a couple passages that just click for me. One of those is in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11. God has made everything beautiful in its time, and he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. Science is an exercise to discover God. It really is. We are amazed at the things we dig into. But I am confident we'll never know the end. We'll never investigate all that he has done. And number two, this sense of eternity in my heart, perfection, those things that we seek after, was implanted there by your Creator. In the passage that was read just before the sermon, again, having looked at everything around us, considered the logical proof, now I want you to hear the power of this passage. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, all unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness do what? They suppress the truth. Because deep down you know it. For what can be known about God is plain because God has shown it to you. For his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made so that they are without excuse. For all they knew God, although they knew him, they did not honor him, they did not give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. And their foolish hearts were darkening. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God with images that look like us. Men and animals. This is not just about the idolatry of carved items, but we tried to make God like us and explain God by the physical thing that we are. And God transcends us. He transcends the physical. And he transcends your ability to reason through this, but he gave you the reason so that you can understand that God is. I am. The monumental phrase from Genesis, I am. Tell them I am sent you. I was, I am, and I will ever be. That's who's in your heart, the I am. Second, it's moving away from the world that is around you. I want to start focusing on what's inside you. Because therein is another proof that God exists. I would venture to guess that none of you came to believe God, frankly, through science. I may be wrong about that. Now, you may have come to believe God through logic. But I would also argue that there's probably several of you who inherently believe that there is a God due to the morality and things that are in our heart. And what's interesting about this is that both theists, those who believe God and in him, and atheists, those who claim that there is no God, both attest that there is some morality we should obtain. And that is comical to me. To think that if there is no God, we have morality. And we'll get to why that's comical to me. But it is impossible to prove or disprove the existence of a non-physical spiritual God through observational science. We use logic to get there. We use science to further proof it. But it still didn't conclude that that God who is beyond physical things can be physically observed. What's the scientific method? The scientific method is we come up with a hypothesis. We design a set of experiments to test that hypothesis. We get measurements, and from those measurements, we draw conclusions. Okay, my hypothesis is God exists. All right, let's work on those experiments. Let's get those measurements. Because he's not physical, that's going to be tough. So again, science can't prove, nor can it disprove God. But the stronger argument is to address my worldview, because the worldview dictates how you interpret those scientific facts. And so let me talk about some worldviews here. Philosophers throughout the history have argued for some objective standard of truth, of good. And they conclude that there must be a source of that good. Let me give you some examples. Maybe some names you've heard of. Plato, 428 to 327. When was Christ born? 03, depending on how you count time, right? So 400 years before Christ was born, Plato had logically concluded that if there is a good, then it self-subsists. It exists because it is good. There is a singular concept of good that exists in the world. And he's not the only one. Thomas Aquinas in 1225, 1274, later on, what he observed is that there are some things that are better than others, right? There are some things, they're good people, but there are some who are better. There are some who are nobler. And so the fact that we can see a more, he concludes, leads us to this idea that there must be a best, a noblest. And so, again, through logic, he's looking at there must be a singular good, this thing that we're attempting to attest to and to attain. Immanuel Kant, that name is still readily referred to. He believed that there was the highest good, that there is this one singular good we are all trying to attain. Let's talk about how he logically arrived. Number one, that this highest good is the goal of everything that we do that is moral. When I do something good, I don't think it's going to affect something positive. I do it because there is something good that I'm trying to attain. And so for him, not only was it that he was trying to get there, but that highest good is possible to achieve. And so God, again, air quotes, that thing that is the highest good, that thing that is the perfect, he concluded that possibility of perfect good is God. That's what that thing is. It represents perfection of morality. And not only that, but he's supreme and complete. And he tried to define what is moral. What is good and moral for us to do? With a God, morality is defined by that thing that we are motivated to accomplish that greatest good. Without God, what is moral? Without God, what is moral? What is immoral? And what I find is that atheists betray their own worldview by the language that they use, by the things that they reflect out of their mouth and believe. You know, we've all heard arguments like these. I've been guilty of being in arguments like these where we bicker and go back and forth fighting, sometimes in the backseat of my own parents' car. Let me give you some examples. Well, how'd you like it if I did that to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He's not hurting you. Why'd you get to go first? Give me some of your candy, and I'll give you some of mine. Come on, you promised. What does that all reflect? Where did we learn that craziness? What chemical synapses created fairness and equity and trust and order? Where did that come from? You think some chemical reaction caused that? Within us, children and grown-ups alike, we have this standard of behavior. It's like a law or a rule that we've all agreed exists, but nobody's defined it. And before you were ever taught about fairness, you cried when something was taken from you. I saw somebody point at somebody else. I love that. And so we must have agreed on something, otherwise we wouldn't fight about it. And so what is that agreement? Now, an atheist would argue that morals are created by our societies. That's where they come from. We have societally agreed that these things are what we'll do. But what's interesting about no matter what society we look at in history, all of them condemn stealing what is someone else's property. All of them condemn lying within a court or in some judicial behavior. All of them condemn committing fraud against an unwary victim or killing an innocent person. What, did we have some universal council that these will be the declared laws? No, they are the declared laws, and they live in here. And we have felt them since we existed. We could verbalize them later, and then we could codify them once we made societies and governments. But they started here. And within you is God's law. So if people are chemical accidents, then why punish someone for killing someone else? Why is that a bad thing? Isn't that what we see in the animal world? You know, we wouldn't get upset at baking soda because it reacted to vinegar. Why would I get upset at a man who reacts at another? It's just how we're wired. And if people are just animals, then why accuse men of crimes? If there is no God, then why do we use words that depict an action as morally wrong or evil? And so murder and steal and rape and plunder and savage, these are just loaded words. When we are just all animals and chemical reactions, why do we use this horrible behavior? If a larger baboon takes a piece of fruit from one of his smaller members, we don't call it theft, that he committed a crime. That's just what baboons do. And if we see an ox gore a man to death, he's not arrested. He's pinned up in a stronger cage, and the public is told to stay away from him. Why don't we do that with mankind? But atheists and theists alike believe that there is a common rule, some common morality, where we punish those who should know better. And so I think that they betray their worldview by the language they use, by holding men accountable. Man, how inconvenient that conscience of yours is. I wish nature would have never created that conscience. That thing within you. If there is no objective morality, then why do we seek for the approval of others? Better yet, why do I seek my own approval when I justify my bad behavior? Oh, you've done that, right? You knew it was wrong, but then here's all the reasons why it was right. And that's you trying to be right within. Humans have a moral nature. We cannot escape it. And if you argue instinct, then I want to talk about how man defies his own instinct. Imagine you standing on the bank of a rapidly flowing river. And while you're standing there admiring the beauty, you see somebody else drowning and crying for help. And you are struck with two instincts. One we might call the natural instinct, which is, that's stupid to jump in that river. I will risk my own life and my own health. And what's that other instinct? And it is save another human who is suffering. Now, if there is no morality, if there is no God, which instinct should win? And yet, why do we have heroes? Why do we have nobility and chivalry and a sense of duty to someone else's personal survival? Because it was put here when you were created. God made that within you. So every act of self-sacrifice and heroism and courage and humble service and tender mercy is evidence that there is a God, and he stuck it within you and put eternity in your heart so that you would have to suppress the truth, not to believe in him. And God is the ultimate source of what is good and what is noble, and he made us like himself. And now again, with that understanding, listen to these powerful passages. Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 50, for when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they don't have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. God set the Israelites aside as a special people and gave them a special law. What was his expectation of the rest of the world for those thousands of years? The law that he stuck right here and the proof that he is. And we have the same today. So where does that objective morality come from? Romans 2:12, for all who have sinned outside of the law or without the law, they'll perish outside the law. And all those who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. So if you're here today, whether you know what's in that Bible or not, you've violated this. And you know that he exists. And he expects you to do something about it. So where does the objective morality come from? Well, it's not material and physical. We didn't get morality from synapses and chemical reactions. It doesn't explain it. Science can't measure it. It doesn't work. And it's not of instinct. And it transcends culture. Without God, human beings have no objective moral values. There is no universal morality. And as a consequence, genocide is not morally wrong. And what's interesting about that, there are very few who will accept that end conclusion. And I appreciate Richard Dawkins for the logical end that he arrived. There is no design. There is no purpose. There is no evil. There is no good. We are just DNA replicating machines if there is no God. And atheists who refuse to arrive at that conclusion are lying to themselves and deny their own worldview. Because without God, there is no evil and there is no good. We are just the result of what happened up here. Finally, he showed us by what he created and what he made. He demonstrated of what lives inside you that he is, and that there is an objective truth and an objective morality. But he proved it by the resurrection of his Son, whom he sent to this earth. Make no mistake, Jesus was not a good man. He was not a wise teacher or a prophet. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and if he was not, he is a liar, a thief, a conjurer, a crook. But he claimed to be the Son of God. My sheep hear my voice in John 10, and I know them, and they will follow me, and I will give them eternal life. They will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one's able to snatch them out of his hand. If that's wrong, he's not a good man. If that's wrong, he's nothing to be admired. John 14:6, Jesus said to them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And he pointed to his miracles as proof of his claims. John 14, verse 11, believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on the account of the works themselves. If you don't believe my words, look at what I'm doing. He healed people. He raised people from the dead. He had power over the natural elements to calm the winds, to still the storm, to walk on water. Don't listen to what he says. Watch what he does. And if you do, you will listen to what he says. And people followed Jesus because they saw the miracles, and then they listened to what he said. Peter's countrymen didn't deny what they saw. They saw the miracles. If anybody was going to deny that he did these things, would it not be the generation who lived next to him? Oh, you didn't walk on water. We saw what you did. But they couldn't deny it. His enemies didn't deny his miracles. And I think this is one of the most powerful signs. John 11:47. The chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council together and said, what are we going to do? For this man performs many signs. Stop. That's not our issue. And if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe him. We cannot argue what he's doing, but we disagree with what he says. And they watch what he's doing, and they will agree with what he says. And that was their concern. And the ultimate proof was the resurrection, when Jesus was declared to be God's Son with power. And here's where we're going to end with these proofs. How do I know that Jesus was resurrected from the dead? Number one, because of the empty tomb. The chief priests and the Pharisees in Matthew 27 gathered together before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember how that impostor said that while he's still alive, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore order that the tomb be sealed until the third day, unless his disciples go and steal him, and to tell the people that he's risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first. And Pilate said, you have a guard? Go make it as secure as you can. So they went and made that tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. And yet, how did we find it? We found it empty. And we have eyewitness confirmation from Mary Magdalene and the other Mary who went to see this tomb, and they experienced an earthquake. They saw the angel and the tomb was found open. Well, you can't believe him. They were just with the imposter. But what's interesting about that is when the enemies talked to their bosses in chapter 11, while they were going, behold, some of the guard went to the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers. Why? Don't tell that story. Tell the people his disciples came by night and stole him away while you were asleep. And we'll make sure you don't end up dead for dropping the guard, because that would have been your punishment. they had the same story that the two Marys did. That tomb was empty. And not only that, but he made several post-mortem appearances. I'll make 0 post-mortem appearances, just in case you were wondering. But he made several. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, we see Peter, we see the 12, we see over 500 people in one occasion. We see James, the apostles again, and Paul. In other accounts, Mary Magdalene, the women on the road, the two to the road to Emmaus, the apostles several times, with and without Thomas, the 7 at Tiberias, and when he gave the Great Commission. All of these times, they witnessed Christ. Thomas doubted that this happened and was convinced by the evidence that he saw and gave his eyewitness testimony to these things. The tomb was empty. He appeared to others. And Mark's made this comment several times. But the most compelling proof, why would a man die for a lie? If this is some story that you made up, let's say I made up a story, and it's time for me to get whipped and beaten and crucified on a cross, I'm going to give that story up. It ain't that important. But these men argued to their death that Jesus Christ raised from his death. The apostles were beaten. Stephen was murdered for such. The church was persecuted and ravaged and scattered because of their belief. There was violence and murder against those in Acts 12, and Peter was either just tortured or tortured and crucified, as he was told, your arms will be stretched out and you'll be taken where you don't want to go. Why keep up the lie if that's all it was? Why keep up the lie? Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, and we have it by all of these evidences. And so I hope today I've done a sufficient job helping answer this question, at least in my mind and hopefully for yours. Does God exist? Scientists are forced to conclude that this material physical universe began. They don't know how. They're still trying to figure that out, and they hope to goodness, not to God, but they hope to goodness they're going to find some evidence that leads them to a better conclusion than what they've got now. But they have concluded that this earth will decay. And they can't refuse the logic of the explanation, that only something transcending the physical world and greater than it could have created it. And your heart doesn't lie. Man seeking after some higher good and some set of moral choices within you, every one of you knows that there is a God. And to believe anything different is simply a suppression of the truth that you know within. And if that wasn't enough, God gave his Son on this life to die and prove through his resurrection that God does exist. And he wants you to believe in him. He wants you to come to him so that he can mercifully forgive you for what you violated here and the law that he gave you that you've also violated. He wants you to be his child and to be with him, the only place that is eternal, in heaven. And if you have sin in your life from which you've not repented, if you've never named Christ as the Son of God who created all that we have and all that is within, we offer this time to you now to come to him while together we stand and as we sing.